Okay, thanks for tuning in. Today we have Shane Malone talking about the paper Aerobic Fitness and Playing Experience, Protect Against Spikes in Workload, the role of acute and chronic workload ratio and injury risk in elite Gaelic football. So welcome, Shane.
Thanks for having me, Rob. It's a pleasure.
It's good to have you, mate. So do you just want to give us a little, very short intro on you and then maybe move into, firstly, why this area of research for you? Where's the interest come from?
So I'm currently a PhD student in Liverpool, John Moores, doing my research externally through the Gaelic Sports Research Centre based in Tallaght in Ireland. I suppose would have done my undergrad originally in sports science, and I've been lucky to be involved with a number of inter-county Gaelic football teams where this research actually has taken place and been conducted in. And so it was conducted with the team that I'm currently working with. We were lucky enough to make the All-Ireland final this year. Unfortunately, we lost. But so it's on the elite end of Gaelic football. And that's sort of where my interest is. The interest is sort of, the PhD topic is sort of on Gaelic football demands, their training load demands, but also their match play demands. So we're looking at both GPS and specifically with this paper, we looked at session RP. But that's sort of where the paper sort of stemmed from, is that it's based within my PhD. But I suppose I'm going to scroll down into the introduction. Just Gaelic football, I suppose many of your listeners mightn't know exactly what it is. So it's a sport that's similar in structure, I suppose, to Australian rules football. Players can sort of undertake sort of 3 to 5 training sessions per week, probably 2 to 3 pitch-based, probably 2 gym sessions on a non-playing week, and then obviously in a playing week there'd be a reduction in training load. But in match play they cover about between 8 and 14k depending on the time of the year, total distance. So what you can sort of take from that off the bat is that players need to have an element of aerobic fitness in order to successfully compete during match play and be able to play or attain the game demands required of them. I suppose where this research stemmed out of from then was there's a lot of interest recently in the injury workload relationship. As we know, a lot of the work has been completed by Tim Gabbett and sort of the Bath research group in Rugby Union and sort of Brent Roglowski down in Australian rules. So I suppose stemming out of that, what we found, I suppose, originally with sort of Tim's work was that as we progress through the year, there's an increase in injury risk depending on sort of the time of the year, but also an increase per arbitrary unit per training session increased your risk of injury. Then I suppose where the acute chronic comes in, or the acute chronic workload ratio, sort of tracking those spikes and loads. So originally Brent Roglowski would have shown that a 75% decrease in weekly load was placing your players at more risk than a 15% increase. And then more recently what we're seeing in Rugby Union is sort of this U-shaped curve where moderate training loads seem to be protective for players. And I suppose that sort of continued on recently with Marcus Colby's work in AFL, where he showed that moderate workloads in the preseason were protective for players. And I suppose then a bit more in depth with the acute chronic, what you're looking at is sort of your weekly load done this week referenced against your 4-weekly average. So if you look at Bannister's model originally, it's sort of trying to understand the fitness fatigue model, which your fatigue being your weekly load and your fitness being what the average of the workload you've done over the past 4 weeks. And I suppose the interest from the acute chronic end comes from the Rugby League research, where we've seen positive and negative effects for high-low workloads, but that the acute chronic work ratio of between 0.85 and 1.35 was sort of protective for players. I suppose then stemming on a little bit more from the research question, we're looking at sort of what offsets injury risk. So we looked at aerobic fitness based on a 1K time trial, but also then we looked at players' playing experience. So basically their time spent on the elite inter-county squad. Gaelic football is a bit different from other sports, where a player can be dropped off a squad whenever a manager sees fit, or if he doesn't think the player is good enough, he drops off the squad. But he still plays Gaelic football, but he goes back to his sub-elite level where he plays with his club team, and the elite level then is your county team. So the research sort of stems from the workload injury relationship, but also trying to understand what load we can put into our athletes that's protective and what load actually places athletes at a higher risk. But then can we offset that by injury and also then the experience of our players?
So just very quickly, I mean, you might get into this in the methods in the further part of the paper, but what metrics do you use to derive the acute chronic?
So the acute chronic workload that we used here was a session RPE method. So basically players were well used to session RPE method because it's something that we collect on a daily and session by session basis with them. So it's a session RPE rated from a 1 being a really, really easy session to a 10 being the hardest session you've ever completed. Now we multiply that by time on the pitch. So in Gaelic football, most of your training sessions sort of range from between 70 minutes to 120 minutes, depending on the time of the year. So, for example, if you had an RP of 6 for a 100-minute session, that's 600 units. And then we add that session by session by session to get our weekly loads. And then within the study, we looked at 1 weekly, 2 weekly, 3 weekly, and 4 weekly loads. Then we also looked at the acute chronic workload ratio and percentage change in weekly load.
Mm-hmm. Cool. So do you just want to maybe first maybe go in reverse and just talk to us through what you found in this paper, and then we'll kind of backtrack and go through the methods?
Yeah, so I suppose the main take-home message from this with relation to Gaelic football players was that high 1 weekly workloads of over 2,700 arbitrary units were related to higher injury risk when compared to a low load reference group of 1,200 units. Then we looked at spikes in load, or we used the acute chronic workload ratio. We found that 1.5 was protective for our players when compared to a low reference group, but when players went above 2 for an acute chronic workload ratio, they were at more likely risk of being injured. We also found sort of phase-dependent associations with injury risk. So to put that into probably a bit more specific context, was that as players progressed through the year, they were more likely to get injured. Now in Gaelic football, the season sort of is different from sort of any other sport, where it's all sort of geared towards one competition called the All-Ireland. So they would do a pre-season which would run from November through to February. Then February there's like a national league or a league competition. But the main focus comes then at the end of the year. So from June, July time to the end of September, or this year into October, there's the All-Ireland competition, which is where all the counties' focus is generally pushed towards. So that means during that time you've higher workloads, naturally because of coaches trying to get technical and tactical work done, but also getting tactical sort of knowledge-based work put into our players in terms of systems-based. But then I suppose moving on from that, then what we wanted to find was what offsetted our injuries. So we found that players who had 1 year experience or were 1 year on the panel were at a higher risk of injury compared to 2 and 3 year players and 4 and 6 year players. So basically, experience in Gaelic football protects you from injury. And this is a sort of a real topic of interest in Gaelic football now, because we're seeing that underage athletes are suffering more injuries when they come into the senior squads because they're not used to the demands of senior training. So we sort of suggested in our piece that management, medical staff and conditioning staff should work together as sort of a round-based group to sort of plan loads with regard to specific cohorts of our players. Then we wanted to look at fitness as an offsetter for injury risk, and we found that players who had poor aerobic fitness, as estimated from a 1K time trial, were at more likely risk of getting injured, but also our fitter players could respond more positively to changes in load. So they could withstand higher acute chronic workload ratios. And basically, overall, what we're looking at is sort of moderate workload coupled with moderate to high changes in acute chronic workload ratio appear to be protective for Gaelic football players in an overall sense, but that if you have higher experience and a high fitness level, you can respond better to these changes, or coaches can put more load into these players. So it's sort of trying to get into that sort of individualized element of planning training load is the overall conclusions from our study.
So you mentioned a couple of times that Gaelic football isn't like any other sport, but so how transferable is this data and research to other sports?
The only, I suppose, from the offset is that every team is collecting session RP because it's such an easy method of quantifying training load. And every team is sort of looking to improve players' fitness levels to a degree in order that they recover better. But also every team knows the experience, or every staff knows the experience of their team. So I think although the season structure might be different, I think this study ticks a lot of boxes in terms of transferability to other sports. In terms of that, we know that players collect training load data like session RPE all the time. It's very easy to run a 1K time trial, and it's very easy then to look at your acute chronic, but also understand the experience levels of your team. I suppose where this research kind of differs from other research is that in Australian rules football, they found that younger players were less likely to get injured than older players. But I think within our research, we sort of found it with Gaelic football players that the more time you spend on the squad, the more used to the load and the prescription of the load that you are, which makes, I think, sort of logical sense from a point of view that players are coming from underage structures straight into senior structures, and the load from underage to senior can increase quite highly, so that the experience there plays a role in protecting players from injury. But I think as well, if we look at the loads that are weekly loads in Gaelic football, they're very similar to loads that are completed both in soccer, in AFL and rugby league. So like our average week, depending on the phase of the year, might be around 2,500 to 3,500 units, which is sort of similar to, if you look at the James Malone's research in football, if you look at Brent Roglowski's work in Australian football, if you look at Tim Gabett's work in Australian football, it's similar type of loads that we're putting in. So I think that this research is definitely transferable across sports. But I think you might take a couple of caveats out of it and apply it to your own sport. I think what we must be aware of is that each sport has its own relationship with load, and every player will have his or her own relationship with load. So that these are giving you guidelines, but again, you might take 2 or 3 pieces of this research and apply it within your own settings.
Mm-hmm. Do you just want to scroll down and take us through a little bit more in depth about the methods, about what you how you actually went about taking part in this, doing this for us? That's
no issue. So we looked at was sort of a year of data, so a full training year of data with the intercounty team that we're based with. So this team is a National League Division 1 team, but also participates at a high level in the All-Ireland. So they're in the top division in Gaelic football, and they're also competing at the top end in terms of the All-Ireland. We looked at 37 players over one season, and then basically we classified experience as time being spent on the squad, which is for Gaelic football, as I said, is probably a bit specific to Gaelic football, considering that players can be just dropped off a squad and still compete in sub-league competition, and if they compete well there, they can be brought back onto the squad. So excuse me. So the senior level playing experience of our team was about 8 plus minus 4 years, so a quite experienced team. In terms of our time loss classification, then we collected in conjunction with the medical and physio team, we collected all our injury data on a bespoke database that is very bespoke to the county. The definition of our injury mirrors the consensus statement done by Brooks and on Team Sport Athletes. Then we classified our injuries both based on site, mechanism and time loss. So when we're looking at it, we had a really, really stringent sort of classification for injury, but also we knew where the injury was taking place, when it was taking place, the time of the match it was taking place, for example, whether it was first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter, whether that's within both training and match play. So across the season, we would have had 161 both pitch and gym-based sessions. So we collected session RP when gym and pitch session. So it basically, the study quantifies all the load that our players are doing. We then classified our load, as I said previously, based on the session RP method of a 1 to 10 Borg scale rating multiplied by the time spent, whether that's in a gym session or on the pitch. Then across the year, we would have ran a 1K time trial as one of our fitness test measures. So basically, players would run 1K, not a continuous circular 1K. It was 10 by 100 meter shuttles. And basically, the final time then from that 1K was used as an analysis of aerobic fitness. Then I suppose we broke our competitive season down into pre-season and early in season and late in season. So basically to reflect, as I said previously, the way Gaelic football competition is based, that it's all sort of late in season loaded to a degree because there's such a focus on the All-Ireland. And then when we were looking at our load measures, we looked at 1, 2, 3, and 4 weekly loads. We also looked at percentage change in load, and then we also looked at our acute chronic workload ratio, being our weekly load divided by our 4-week average of session RP. Then when we were looking at our statistical analysis, we collected data basically from 3,500 individual player sessions, and we had 91 injuries across the year, which in Gaelic football terms, although is high in terms of team sports, within Gaelic football terms, the data is actually quite comparable. So you see recent research released by Mark Rowe on hamstring injuries. So if you look at there per 1,000 hours, this study is quite similar to that. So off that, we modelled the injury using a linear regression, of which the model was about 85%. The statistical power of the model was 85%. And basically, it was a linear regression with a binary log function linked in, and we just looked at injury versus no injury, yes or no, in the logistical regression for a reference group against, a low load reference group against a moderate, low, moderate, and high reference groups. And basically what we did is then we collected odds risk ratios, so the likelihood that you'll attain an injury given a certain workload hit. Within the model, then we looked at sort of inflation factors. So basically, to explain this simply, it's to understand if there's collinearity between variables. So within some studies, as highlighted by Cross, they found that 1 weekly load was heavily linked to 3 weekly load. So they got rid of 1 and 3 weekly loads because they were telling them the same thing. But within our study, we found that our measures of load were for an inflation factor were within acceptable limits. So we looked at 1, 2, 3, and 4 weekly load. Do you want me to go on into a bit more detail with the results, or?
You can do, mate. I know you've kind of chatted through them, but it'd be nice to just see it on the screen so people can get a bit of an image in the mind.
Okay, so to put it into context, with 91 injuries, it basically equated to 2.4 injuries per player, which when you think about it, 2.4 injuries per player is quite high, but within Gaelic football, it's actually within similar research published, so it's similar to previous research. Interestingly, we found that match play incidence was higher than training incidence in terms of injuries per 1,000 hours. So I suppose the question that comes from this is that, and this is something that we even had an argument within our own team, was that are we properly preparing our players for match play demands? And our injury incidence would probably suggest that we're not. So we've aimed to look at this and address this as we progress through the year. Look at match play volumes, they're sort of similar enough to soccer in that we had high training volumes. Our match volumes are really low though. We've only 1,200 match hours when you compare that to about 6,000 training hours. So when you look at it, we do a lot of training in Gaelic football, but our match play events come in sort of clusters, or they come in sort of even match on a Sunday, you might play for 4 more weeks type approach. And this sort of might explain why when we looked at our absolute workloads, there was no real difference in training load across phases, which is really different to any sport. Like you'd see a high preseason load and it drops off slowly as you go into the in-season. But because I suppose Gaelic football, there's sort of low match volumes and high training volumes, our loads didn't differentiate. There was no differentiation in our loads across the 3 phases.
Sorry to interrupt there, Shane.
Yeah.
These guys are part-time.
They're amateur athletes, but
yeah,
they're amateur athletes that train professionally. So when you look at Gaelic football, you could have a training session on a Tuesday at 7 o'clock, 2.5 hours away from when you live. You travel there, you train for 100 minutes, then you might be back on a bus and you're traveling for 2.5 hours. So you might get home. Then players might come home at 12 o'clock at night. They'll be up for work at 7 a.m. the next day. So I suppose when you think about it that way, they're amateur athletes, but they're training for 3, 4, 5 times a week. So they have a professional ethos and professional fitness levels as well. When you look at Gaelic football, their fitness levels and the match loads that they attain are very similar, if not better, than some of the professional sports that are out there. So I suppose when we look at the absolute workloads then, we're seeing that players who have high 1 weekly loads were at higher risk when compared to a low reference group. Similarly, when we looked at 2 and 3 weekly loads, higher groups were at more risk of injury. That's before we take into account both changes in workload and then the potential for fitness and experience to offset this load. When we look at changes in workloads then, we saw that injury risk was phase dependent, first of all. So players were at more likelihood of injury risk during the late in season when compared to the preseason. And that's when they experienced a change in load of about 1,000 arbitrary units a week when compared to 120 units per week. Then when we looked at the in-season acute chronic workload, sort of ratios of between 1.35 and 1.5 were protective for our players. So if you think that sort of a 35 to 50% increase in load weekly was protective. Now, this sort of has to be put into context with recent research that's been brought out by Tim Gabet and Rod Wheatley, who showed that this is within sort of acceptable limits for changes in load. They released an IGSPP sort of invited review where between 10 and 50% was acceptable or was found to be protective for players. I suppose when we look at Denix player experience, we found the first year players were at higher risk of injury when compared to our more experienced players. And within Gaelic football, it's sort of a topic of interest in that when minor players or players who are coming into the squad for the first year, they don't have the training capacity that our older players have. So they're experiencing, in some cases, a 40, 50, 60% jump in GPS load. And that's sort of reflected then in their session RP load. When we looked then at another offsetter, we found that aerobic fitness was better aerobic fitness as considered as better 1K time trial performance was protective for our players. So your fitter players, you could put more load into them, you could change their load, and they were less likely to get injured when compared to your low fitness level players.
Cool. Just before we round up, limitations first of all, Shane.
So limitations, we'll just scroll down because we actually did a methodological considerations for our study. So what we know is that, I suppose, based on our injury research, we know that previous injury increases your likelihood of getting injured. Now, we didn't actually factor that in because just of the amount of data that we would have had to go through. It's something that we're looking at doing now within future studies. We also need to consider, and I think all sports scientists and conditioning coaches would agree, that our wellness scores, so our soreness, our fatigue, our mood, our sleep ratings, and also any psychological stressors, especially in amateur sports, so whether that's a work stressor or an exam stressor because he's in college, these are definitely likely going to impact on injury risk for our players. So it's something that future research in Gaelic football and probably in other sports needs to consider and try and map out using odds risk ratios or any other method of association that they can. So I suppose another limitation was that we weren't able to describe our session-specific training loads. So, for example, you might be able to do a global load on the session, but we know probably, and it's sort of intuitive thinking, is that within sessions you might have a different construction of a training session. So it might be an 80-20 split for football and fitness. It might be all small-sided games versus drill-based skills work. So I suppose what we need to do is get down into the nitty-gritty in future research and look at specific components of training load. And also, where does that come from? Are we getting higher loads in small-sided games versus linear drills? Are we getting higher loads in fitness running versus our match play running, for example? I suppose then we didn't look at GPS. We had GPS data, but we didn't look at it in conjunction with the session RP paper because we just would have had too much data and we wouldn't have been able to get across the message as well as if we just focused on session RP. So I suppose what comes out of this then is that we need to, maybe our future research needs to look at the idea of an internal training load ratio. So looking at the total distance divided by the RP, or looking at the total distance covered divided by the internal cost of that movement. And what we might get from that is both a ratio that might be sensitive to fatigue, sensitive to injury, sensitive to fitness, but is also an exercise economy ratio. I think that's something of real interest for us as within Gaelic football, but maybe other sports as well. And I suppose then we know that an injury workload model is specific to the team it's done on. So what we need to do is combine our session RP data with other teams that mightn't be at the same level, or they might be at the same level, but we need to look at their specific characteristics. So are they fitter? Do they have a less experienced squad, a more experienced squad? And we need to pull that data together and run multiple seasons of data in order to better understand the workload injury relationship in Gaelic football and other sports.
Brilliant. So just to kind of give one last message, how would you, so very quickly, a couple of practical implications for this? I know you've touched it on at the start, but just as a kind of, as a roundup and a final message. Here we are.
Here we are. So I suppose if I look at the practical implications, firstly from a Gaelic football specific point of view, this is the first study to find, to basically show the training loads, but also show what risk occurs with what load. So I suppose from a Gaelic football view, it's a really important paper that will have implications for many teams within Gaelic football. I suppose if we look at it from a cross-sport point of view, we know the higher acute chronic workloads of over 2 were associated with substantial injury risk in our paper. I think if we look at the moderate to high acute chronic workload of 1.3 to 1.5, it appears to be protective for our players, but that also falls within other research that have shown might be 1 to 1.35, which fits our model. It might be 1.1 to 1.45 that fits again within our model, and that's within sports such as rugby league or soccer or Australian rules football that research has been done on. I suppose the main thing and the main take-home point from our research would be that aerobic fitness protects players from injury. So if you can prescribe loads effectively to get your athletes fit, they're less likely to get injured, and also you can manipulate the load then without having a fear of getting your players injured. We also know that the more players that you've available, the better chance your team has of being successful. So I would encourage all teams to use session RPE. I think most of them are, but also that you collect your injuries, you model them, and you look at sort of potential characteristics that might offset that injury. And that's sort of one of the main recommendations. And I suppose finally, you need a cross-disciplinary approach when you're monitoring and prescribing loads. So you need to include your management, your coaches, your medical team, your rehabilitation team, your strength and conditioning staff, your sports scientists, and just all sit down, bash out what needs to be done, plan the loads, and see what happens with those loads. And also plan them effectively without high spikes in load.
Fantastic. So where can which journal is this in, Shane?
You can find us in IGSPP, so the International Journal of Sports Physiology and Performance. You can download it or request it from my ResearchGate page as well, and it's on my Twitter account as well.
Nice. And what is your Twitter account? Last but not least,
at Shane Malone 01. So at Shane Malone 01.
Great stuff. Well, thanks for running through that with us, and I'll let you get on with your day.
Cheers. Thanks a lot for having me, Rob. It's a pleasure.
All right, pal.
Thanks.
Speak soon, mate.
Bye.